Alaska's vast frontier-like landscape offers a unique way of life and a sense of isolation for those who crave it. Beautiful but difficult terrain make many areas of Alaska accessible only by plane. It can be an ideal place to call home if you have something to hide. Twice the size of Texas, Alaska is the largest state in the Union. Alaska likewise has the highest rate of violent crime in the nation, with over 75 villages having no law enforcement of their own. In many areas of the state, it can take days for law enforcement to reach you. Alaska has the highest rate of serial murders in the country. Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska, but is still a small community. Dotted around the city, numerous coffee kiosks offer warm comfort against the brutal cold, and launched many of the current coffee trends, making their way across the lower 48. So prevalent are the kiosks and coffee that many residents feel Anchorage is the true home of the coffee-obsessed, not Seattle. Samantha Koenig worked at one of these kiosks, called Common Grounds, located off Tudor Road. The 18-year-old was working the evening shift alone on February the 1st, 2012, when her boyfriend arrived to pick her up around 8:30 p.m. His name has not been released to protect his privacy. The kiosk was dark and eerily quiet. Samantha was not there. Unable to reach her on her cell phone, he drove to her home he shared with Samantha and Samantha's father, James. Samantha was not there either. He explained the situation to Samantha's father. At 11:24 that night, the boyfriend would receive a text message from Samantha's phone number indicating that she had a bad day and was going to spend a couple of days with her girlfriends. She said to tell her father and that she would be acting weird. But the message was unlike Samantha's usual texting style. It just didn't sound like her. By the early hours of the next morning, Samantha's father was frantic. She was still not home, and no one could reach her or had any idea where she might be. James contacted the owner of Common Grounds, who was able to pull a surveillance video from the kiosk. They were shocked at what they've captured. The video shows Samantha working when a customer in a ski mask ordered a drink at around 8 p.m. It was bitterly cold, and ski masks are quite common. As she turned to serve the drink, Samantha jumped back, with her hands up, clearly startled. The customer had pulled a gun on her. Quickly, she turned out the lights in the kiosk, nervously complying with the customer's demands. She emptied the cash register and the safe, handing over the cash to the masked gunman. The customer jumped in through the window and led Samantha outside, where they disappeared across the parking lot. James called the police. Recognizing the seriousness of what had occurred, the police quickly contacted the FBI to assist them as they scoured the area and canvassed local businesses. Another security camera had captured part of Samantha's abduction. They saw her being led to what appeared to be a 1999 to a 2000 white Chevrolet truck. Unfortunately, several thousand trucks fit that description locally. Samantha's father organized a search beginning at the Common Grounds. Dozens of Samantha's friends and other stunt members of the community joined him and held a candlelight vigil. They blanketed the area with flyers, raised money for a reward, and waited. 2.5 weeks later, the investigation had stalled when Samantha's boyfriend received a text from Samantha's phone. It read, Corner Park, sign under pic of Albert, ain't she pretty? Police and FBI raced to the park and found the sign with a memorial picture of Albert the Golden Doodle tacked behind it with a plastic baggie containing a Polaroid picture and a ransom note. The photograph was fuzzy, showing a young woman next to a recent edition of the Anchorage Daily News. James Koenig identified his only daughter, but noted she looked odd. The ransom demanded $30,000 be placed in Samantha's bank account. Working with her father, they deposited a portion of the money. The bank flagged the account to alert law enforcement immediately should the account be accessed. Within a couple of days, there were 3 withdrawals made from the account from ATMs around Anchorage. Each time, law enforcement was notified, and each time the kidnapper was gone by the time they arrived. ATM surveillance would show a carefully disguised man wearing dark glasses, a mask over his mouth and nose, and a hood over his head. The account was not accessed again until March the 7th, 2012, when a withdrawal occurred in Arizona, then another in New Mexico. Then, on March the 10th, another withdrawal was made in Humble and Shepherd, Texas. Each surveillance video showed a man wearing a mask, but police were able to see the man was driving a white Ford Focus and was clearly travelling east. A bolo, or be on the lookout, was made with a description of the car and the clothing of the masked man. On the morning of March the 13th, 2012, a Texas Highway Patrolman in Lufkin, Texas, spotted a vehicle matching their description. When the car made a minor traffic infraction, he pulled the vehicle over. The rental car pulled into the parking lot of Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin. The patrolman questioned the driver and searched the car. Inside, he found clothing that matched the APB. The driver also had Samantha's debit card and her cell phone, but Samantha was not with him. Isreal Keys was placed under arrest for using a stolen debit card. FBI was quickly on the scene. Keys asked to call his brother, who had his daughter with him nearby, but said nothing else. The 34-year-old was extradited back to Alaska. When authorities searched his home, they found a white Chevrolet truck. Initially, Isreal Keys refused to answer any questions. However, a few hours later, Isreal's defense attorney called the FBI to say he was willing to talk if they met a few of his own demands. Keys wanted a cigar, an Americano, and a peanut butter Snickers bar. The FBI agreed. Satisfied, Keys gave the FBI a detailed confession. His description was so cold and graphic, the FBI refused to release the full audio. Keys confessed to having stalked out the Common Grounds coffee kiosk for several days, planning to rob it and, if conditions allowed, kidnap the barista working that night. It didn't matter whom. Isreal Keys admitted this was a risk, to strike so close to his home. On February the 1st, after leaving Common Grounds with Samantha, she fought back and almost escaped. Keys was able to subdue her and bound her with zip ties. He then drove around rural Alaska for several hours, until he was certain his girlfriend and his daughter were asleep. Isreal Keys kept his police scanner on to track any reports of Samantha's abduction. None came. Back at his home, Isreal Keyes placed her in a shed just outside his home that he had prepared the night before with ropes, a space heater, garbage bags, and a sleeping bag. He turned on a radio to cover any noise Samantha might make. He told her he would kill her if she screamed. He demanded Samantha's debit card and her cell phone, but she had neither on her in the shed. The phone, she explained, was still at common grounds, and her debit card was in her boyfriend's truck. She told him where to find each of them. Isreal Keyes returned to the kiosk and retrieved Samantha's phone, which she used to text her boyfriend the misleading text about Samantha going away for a few days in an effort to stall any police involvement. Then he brazenly went to Samantha's home, opened her boyfriend's unlocked truck, and stole her debit card. While Isreal was rummaging through the truck, Samantha's boyfriend heard a noise outside. When he went to investigate, he saw a strange man walking from his truck. The boyfriend shouted at the man, who then ran away. The boyfriend rushed inside his home to call for help, but the stranger was long gone. It would be weeks before anyone would learn the significance of this incident. Isreal Keyes then went to the ATM to check Samantha had given him the correct PIN and acquire her account balance before returning home. When he returned, Isreal Keyes said he poured himself a glass of bourbon and a small glass of red wine for Samantha. He allowed her to drink it before he continued. Throughout the night, Keyes raped and abused Samantha, as his living girlfriend and his young daughter slept just feet away inside the home. Isreal Keyes murdered Samantha by strangling her with a zip tie and stabbing her. It's suggested, that not confirmed publicly, that Isreal Keyes engaged in necrophilia with Samantha's dead body. Laughing to the FBI, Isreal Keyes stated, "You have your monster." But the story was far from finished. In exchange for another Americano and Snickers bar, Isreal Keyes told the authorities where they could find Samantha. After he murdered her, Keyes hung Samantha's body by the neck to ensure she was dead. Then he calmly walked inside and showered. A few hours later, Isreal Keyes moved Samantha's body, wrapping it in a tarp and placing it inside a cupboard within the shed. He then packed, woke his daughter for school and left for New Orleans. He would spend the next 2 weeks relaxing on a cruise around the Caribbean islands. With his cruise over, Isreal Keyes drove through Texas for an extra thrill. He decided to rob a bank in the small town of Isreal, but first he needed a diversion to draw local law enforcement away from the National Bank of Texas. Driving to nearby Aledo, Keyes selected a home, burglarized it, and set it on fire. As the black smoke began to rise, he returned to Isreal and robbed the bank, getting away cleanly. He continued on to Houston to fly back home. Once he returned, Samantha's body had frozen. Isreal Keyes carefully thawed her out using a hairdryer for the next part of his twisted plan. After having sex with her once more, Isreal Keyes carefully applied several layers of makeup to Samantha's face and fixed her hair, same way he liked to fix his own daughter's hair. He then sewed Samantha's eyes open to make her appear alive. Placing a recent newspaper next to her, Keyes took the photo found with the ransom demand, making it just a little blurry to conceal Samantha's fate. Samantha had been dead for 2.5 weeks, but the freezing conditions in the shed helped to preserve her body and slow decomposition. Once he had the ransom photo, Isreal Keyes dismembered Samantha's body and found an area on Matanuska Lake where the water is at its greatest depth. Posing as an ice fisher, Isreal Keyes disposed of Samantha's body piece by piece under the ice. He also caught several fish while he was there, which he took home to cook for his family. He then burned everything within the shed, saving only Samantha's cell phone, driver license, and debit card. Police searched the area Isreal Keyes indicated and had to cut through the thick ice to get to the water. Using an underwater camera and a team of divers, they quickly located Samantha's remains. Up until now, Samantha's family and friends had thought she was still alive. They were devastated to learn what she had endured. After disposing of Samantha, Isreal Keyes and his daughter flew to Las Vegas and rented a car. They then began the drive to Texas, where he planned to attend his sister's wedding. He used Samantha's debit card along the way. This would be his fatal mistake and lead to his capture. Isreal was too cold and casual discussing Samantha's murder. The FBI suspected she was not his only victim. When pressed, Isreal was coy. He hinted at other murders and crimes, but he wouldn't confess without something in return. He would continue to fight for control of these interviews throughout the process. Isreal admitted he didn't care about his own name or reputation, but he was concerned for his daughter and his family. He wanted his name kept out of the media to protect them. This was the only time he expressed any concern or remorse related to his crimes, that his daughter might suffer because of what her father had done. "I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all of this hanging over her head," explained by Isreal Keyes. He also said he didn't want his daughter to one day, quote, "type my name into a computer and have it pop up." Isreal Keyes also wanted the death penalty. He wanted an execution date before he would admit to any more of his crimes. Alaska does not have the death penalty. However, the federal government does. The FBI conceded they may be open to this sentence, but his current known federal crimes didn't merit that level of punishment. The smirking Isreal Keyes didn't think this would be an issue once they knew the extent of his crimes. The FBI agreed to keep his name and the extent of his crimes quiet. Over the next several months, Isreal Keyes slowly revealed his secret life. What he divulged to the authorities would show him to be one of the most cunning and methodical serial killers they had ever encountered. Isreal Keyes was born on January the 7th, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. He was the second of 10 children, born into a devout Mormon family. When Isreal was around 5 years old, his family moved to the isolated area of Washington State, just outside of Colville, Washington. Isreal was kept somewhat isolated from his peers. He was homeschooled and not allowed to participate in sports or any other social activities outside the church. He had only a few friends. In Washington, Isreal's family began to attend the Ark, also known as Our Place Fellowship. The church is on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate groups. The Keys would occasionally socialize with a neighbor family, the Cahos, who attended the same church. The Cahos would become infamous in their own right. They embraced a violent white supremacist viewpoint. Brothers Chevy and Shane, along with their father, would build arrest records that range from murder to theft and burglary to polygamy in support of their extreme Aryan and anti-government ideology. Chevy was investigated in connection with the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, for which Timothy McVeigh was convicted and executed, but police could not link him conclusively. Though it doesn't appear that Isreal subscribed to his beliefs, he would eschew religion as an adult. He was drawn to the violence the church and his new friends espoused. Isreal asserted to the FBI that he had violent fantasies and urges beginning at a young age. At 14 years old, Isreal took a family cat into the woods with a couple of boys around his age that were staying with the family. Isreal tied the cat to a tree and shot it in the stomach. He said he laughed as the cat struggled, trying to get away, but ultimately wrapping itself around the tree tighter until it died. But when Isreal turned to look at the other boys, they were shocked. One was vomiting. This wasn't what normal kids did for fun, after all. He decided he needed to be more discreet. Throughout his teens, Isreal's criminal activity escalated. He was torturing animals for entertainment. He also began breaking into homes and stealing guns, amassing a large cache of weapons. He was growing more interested in inflicting pain on others. He began studying serial killers and criminal profiling books. He took notes of their crimes, methods, how they avoided detection, and particularly why they would get caught. Once Isreal told his strict and devout parents that he was an atheist, they kicked him out of the house. He was around 17 years old. He moved to Mopin, Oregon, where Isreal confessed to the FBI he committed his first attempt at murder in the summer of 1997 or 1998. Isreal explained he staked out a location beforehand near the Deschutes River and identified the best place to take a victim, an old outhouse abandoned in the woods. The river was a popular place for rafting and tubing. Then Keys waited for a victim. A group of young women were out rafting on the river. When one of them became separated from the group, Isreal grabbed her, took her to the outhouse, tied her up, and raped her. Isreal admitted to the FBI that this was not his first rape, but it was his first victim he intended to kill. However, the woman did not fight him and instead talked to him, getting inside his head. He lost his nerve and let her go, swearing to find her and kill her should she go to the police. No records are found to indicate she ever told authorities, and she still has never come forward. Isreal was nervous and paranoid. He should have killed her, he thought. I was too timid. I wasn't violent enough, he told investigators. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again. After this confession, Isreal clammed up. He wanted his death sentence guaranteed, but the FBI needed more. Israel asked for another Americano and Snickers bars. The FBI and local law enforcement again agreed to Israel's demands to keep his name out of the news. Israel was adamant. Leak it and he would stop cooperating. They provided him with various newspapers to assure him the promise was being kept. He said he would give them 2 more bodies, but needed a map of the Burlington area of Vermont. Israel began explaining that he put together what are referred to as his kill kits, which he buried at various places he had staked out all around the country for future use. The kits contained guns with silencers and ammunition, flashlights, shovels, duct tape, rope, cash, various caustic chemicals, and other useful items. All the buried treasure a serial killer would need restrain, murder, and dispose of bodies, as well as destroy any evidence he might have left behind. Israel stated he thought he had at least 12 of these kill kits stashed in different areas. Often these kits would remain buried for years until Israel needed them. Israel did not have a specific victim type that he hunted, which makes him unusual, but these kill kits and the level of pre-planning he engaged in would be his signature. By choosing various types of victims and hiding his supplies in advance, Isreal Keys was able to avoid detection. He could travel without the tools of his crimes. He could attack at his leisure. There was nothing to link his crimes. One of these kits was buried near Burlington, Vermont in 2009. He would return for it in 2011. On June the 9th, 2011, William, Bill, and Lorraine Correa both failed to show up for their jobs. Concerned, friends and family went to their home and found that a window at the back of their house was broken and the phone lines had been cut. Their car was missing, along with Lorraine's purse and their cell phones. There was no sign of the couple. Police had no suspects, no bodies, and no clues. The case quickly grew cold. Until Isreal Keys got his coffee and candy in Alaska in April of 2012. Israel admitted he was bored in early June 2011. He decided it was time for another trip. Flying from Alaska to Chicago, Israel rented a car and drove the nearly 1,000 miles to Vermont. He was careful to only use cash, and he removed the battery from his cell phone so he could not be easily traced. He vacationed around the Burlington area for a few days and even purchased a fishing license. All the while, he was studying the landscape. On June 8, 2011, he felt prepared and organised. He retrieved his kill kit from where he had buried it 2 years prior and went to the house he had identified in nearby Essex, Vermont. It was a secluded home with no dogs or children. The neighbours were sufficiently far away enough. He could get in and out easily, and they had a car. It seemed like the home of the older couple he could quickly overpower. Late at night, Israel removed a fan from the garage window and hid inside. Israel cut the phone lines to prevent any phone calls for help, but also to disable any security alarms that might be active, and waited for a couple hours before striking. Using a crowbar from the garage and armed with the kill kit gun, Isreal Keys broke a window that led from the garage into the home and gained entry while Bill and Lorraine were quietly asleep. Wearing a headlamp to see in the dark home, Isreal Keys blitzed attack the couriers in their bed. He subdued them before they realized what was happening, binding each with zip ties. He led them to their own car and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he had located. While Isreal Keys secured Bill to a stool in the basement of the derelict home, Lorraine managed to escape from the car, where she had been left. But Isreal caught the terrified woman, tackling her to the ground and dragging her back to the home. Once again in control, Isreal shot the frantic Bill with a silenced gun in the basement. This was his only murder by gunfire, and Isreal stated he had lost his composure with the uncooperative Bill. Upstairs, Isreal Keys raped Lorraine before strangling her to death. Isreal cleaned up the area. He doused the couriers in drain cleaner and wrapped both bodies in black garbage bags. He then buried them under refuse in the basement. Isreal would abandon the courier's car in a Lowe's parking lot. Someone did spot Isreal driving the courier's car, but the sketch was generated yielding no new leads. He made his way back to his rental vehicle and continued driving. Isreal stopped at a reservoir in Parishville, NY, in which he disposed of his gun and silencer before driving onto Maine. On his return through Vermont a few days later, Isreal would see crime tape around the courier's home and missing posters throughout the town. Isreal explained that his original plan for Vermont was to target a church. He thought he might place his victims sitting in pews for the congregation to find, or perhaps burn the church down with the victims inside. But ultimately, he liked those victims to remain unfound. To prove to the FBI he indeed killed the couriers, Isreal told them where to find Lorraine's handgun, which police had never revealed was missing, as well as its make and model, a rugged snub-nosed .38. He noted that while he took Lorraine's purse, he left Bill's wallet and other details only the killer would know. He provided the address of the abandoned farmhouse where the courier's bodies should be found. Police worked quietly to verify Isreal Keys' story. They recovered both guns and raced to the farmhouse. But the farmhouse was gone. It had been demolished in the time since the murders and most of the property cleared. Though the workers who cleared the property stated there was a foul stench of decay when the basement was raised, none were concerned, dismissing it as remains left by hunters. Hunting was prevalent in the area. Isreal laughed at this information. I had no idea. The bodies of Bill and Lorraine were not there. Presumably and unwittingly, they had been taken to the local landfill with the rest of the debris from the house. Authorities scoured the landfill for more than 12 weeks, sifting through over 10 tons of trash. Bill and Lorraine had never been located. On July the 20th, 2012, a leak was made to the local news in Vermont. Isreal Keys' name was linked to the disappearance of the couriers and to the murder of Samantha Koenig. Isreal was furious when he learned this and shut down. His core requirement violated. Israel wouldn't cooperate freely any longer. The FBI continued to push Isreal as they scrambled to rebuild the relationship with him. Isreal Keyes was fighting to maintain control of the process. He teased that there were more bodies in his wake, but he refused to reveal more than vague details. Isreal eventually told investigators his first murder occurred sometime in mid to late 2001, but gave little more information about the victim or possible location. Authorities had been tracing Isreal Keyes' movements, knowing he frequently took trips to commit his crimes. They knew Isreal had enlisted in the army on the 9th of July 1998 after travelling to New Jersey. He was stationed in Texas, Fort Lewis, Washington, and in Sinai, Egypt. Isreal was adamant that he committed no crimes while he was enlisted. Isreal settled to Near Bay, Washington, with his pregnant girlfriend after his discharge in July 2001. Isreal also admitted to his second and third murders within a few months of his first attack. He said he killed a couple and buried them out in the forest area near a valley. Around these first murders, Isreal became a father to a little girl. He was working as a contractor and developing a solid reputation in the area as a skilled worker. Isreal Keyes intimidated that he killed 2 more people around Washington state, disposing of them in a lake before he decided to start a new life with his daughter, away from her drug and alcohol addicted mother. In March of 2007, he relocated with the girl to Anchorage, Alaska, and set up his own contracting business, Keyes Construction. Isreal Keyes also continued his murder vacations, going overseas occasionally, and he began to rob banks to supplement his income and travel expenses, as well as occasional arson, just for the excitement. Isreal and the FBI would continue their bargaining dance for information through November 2012. Isreal revealed pieces of information for them to chase in exchange for little luxuries, like cigars and Americanos. Tauntingly, Isreal Keyes admitted to the FBI that only one other of his victims' bodies was ever recovered. He would not say if this was a man or a woman, or even a general location. Only that he staged the body to look like death was an accident, and the authorities did in fact rule the victim died accidentally. This victim has never been identified. Showing a rare moment of embarrassment, Isreal Keyes confirmed that he raped both women and men, though he refused to identify these victims. Next, Isreal gave one more vague description of a murder. In April 2009, Isreal travelled to the East Coast under the guise of visiting family. He abducted a woman there, drove with her to the property he owned in New York, killed her, and buried her body near Tupper Lake in New York. The FBI had photos of missing persons that coincided with some of Isreal's travels. They began to show him the images, and one made Isreal pause. One showed a photo of Deborah Feldman. Isreal stated that he was not ready to talk about her yet. The 49-year-old woman was a known drug addict when she vanished around April the 8th, 2009 in New Jersey. The US attorneys had been working for months to solidify a plea arrangement that would guarantee Isreal Keys the death sentence he demanded. Isreal was increasingly frustrated by how long this deal was taking to arrange, but using the murders of the couriers and as an aggravating factor, they were able to charge Keys with capital murder for Samantha's death. It was now late November. They hoped to sign this deal in December 2012. At the Anchorage Correctional Complex, where Isreal Keys was being held, although he had been allowed to use only electric razors, Isreal was mistakenly given a disposable razor. In the early morning of Sunday, December the 2nd, 2012, a prison guard making normal rounds spotted a pool of blood in Isreal's cell. The guard immediately called for help. Isreal had appeared to be sleeping to the guards who checked on him during the night. Pulling back the blanket from the prison cot, the guards found Isreal Keys unresponsive. He was lying face down, his arms folded under his chest, covered in blood and already stiff. At 6:13 a.m., Isreal Keys was officially pronounced dead. It was evident he had carefully collected the blood at first, until he grew too weak to delay being discovered. Several cups and milk containers full of his blood were found just under the cot. Ever meticulous with his murders, Isreal Keys was just as careful with his own. He had slit his wrists with the razor, but also tied a noose of bedsheets around his neck, that then looped around his left ankle, which was bent backwards. In the event he lost consciousness, his foot was fall, causing the noose to strangle him. All these actions were performed discreetly under his blanket so to arouse no alarms. The medical examiner was unable to determine if the blood loss or strangulation was the ultimate cause of Isreal's death. Crumbled in the blood under his cot, a 4-paged handwritten suicide note was later found. The note had to be sent to an FBI laboratory in Virginia to decipher its message through the blood. Isreal offered no apologies or explanations for his crimes. Instead, he has left a creepy poem about his murder. Text of Isreal Keys' suicide note, with mistakes. Where will you go, you clever little worm, if you bleed your horse dry? Back in your ride, the night is still young, street lights push back the black-eyed neat rose. Off to the right a graveyard appears, lines of stones, bodies moulder below. Turn away quick, bob your head to the seat. As straight through that stop sign, you roll loaded truck with lights off slams into your broadside. Your flesh smashed as metal explodes. You may have been free, you loved living your lie. Fate has its own scheme, crushed like a bug, you still die. Soon, now, you'll join those ranks of dead, or your ashes the wind will soon blow. Family and friends will shed a few tears, pretend it's off to heaven you go. But the reality is you were just bones and meat, and with your brain died, also your soul. Send the dying to wait for their death in the comfort of retirement homes. Quickly say, it's for the best. It's best for you, so their fate you'll not know. Turn a blind eye back to the screen, soak in your reality shows. Stand in front of your mirror and you preen, in a plastic castle you call home. Land of the free, land of the lie, land of scheme Americanize. Consume what you don't need, stars you idolize. Pursue what you admit is a dream, then it's American die. Get in your big car, so you can get to work fast. On roads made of dinosaur bones. Punch in on the clock and sit on your ass, playing stupid ass games on your phone. Paper on your wall says you got smarts. The test that you took told you so. But you would still crawl like the vermin you are once your precious power grids blow. Land of the free, land of the lie, land of the scheme, Americanized. Now that I have you held tight, I will tell you a story. Speak soft in your ear so you know that is true. You're my love at first sight, and though you're scared to be near, my words penetrate your thoughts now in an intimate prelude. I looked into your eyes, they were so dark, warm and trusting, as though you had not a worry or care. The more guileless the game, the better potential to fill up those pools with your fear. Your face framed in dark curls like a portrait, the sun shone through highlights of red. What colour, I wonder, and how straight will it turn, plastered back when the sweat of your blood? Your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken, nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter. I feel your body tense up, my hands now on your shoulder, your eyes. Forget the lady called Luck. She does not abide near me, for her powers don't extend to those who are dead. My pretty captive butterfly colourful wings, my hand smears, punishment and tears. Violent metamorphosis. Emerge, my dark moth, princess. Come often and worship on the altar of your flesh. You shudder, and try to shrink far from me. I'll have you tied down and begging to become my sweetie. Okay, talk is over, words are placid and weak. Back it with action, or it all comes off cheap. Watch close while I work now, feel the electric shock of my touch, open your trembling flower, or your petals I'll crush. After Israel's death, the FBI reached out to the media with details of his crimes in an effort to identify more of his victims. They released a detailed timeline of Israel's travels in 2013 and still ask the public to contact them if they have any information that may be relevant. Israel Keyes' family buried him quietly in Deer Park, Washington on December the 9th, 2012. They made no statement to the press. He is not in a better place. He's in a place of eternal torment, the pastor for the Keyes family stated. Isreal was an unusual serial killer and criminal in many regards. He did not have a specified victim type. Like some killers, prefer sex workers, women or men, but this was a deliberate choice to avoid detection. However, after his own daughter was born, Isreal did resolve to never attack children or where children were present. This was his only real criteria. Instead, he would craft a plan and then wait for a victim to come to him. Isreal meticulously planned his crimes and went to great lengths to avoid detection. He would often fly into cities, then drive many miles away to commit his crimes, in areas where he was unconnected. As with the Courier murders, Isreal Keyes flew into Chicago before driving almost 1,000 miles to Vermont. He was careful to use cash when his murder trips and would turn off or remove the battery from his cell phone to limit any tracking authorities might try. He used condoms in his rapes to limit his DNA and would douse bodies in chemicals to further destroy forensic evidence and to speed up decomposition. Isreal scouted out areas, sometimes years in advance, and buried his kill kits in preparation. Very little could link Isreal Keyes to his crimes. Isreal never intended to get caught. He was angry when he was arrested in Texas, not for getting caught, but because his gun was unloaded and he was unable to shoot himself. He'd always planned to go out in a blaze of glory. He never intended to be a name that was associated with evil. He executed his crimes so carefully that to date only one body has ever been recovered that has been conclusively identified as his victim. And Samantha was only recovered because Isreal told the authorities exactly where to look. Isreal was caught because he fell into the same traps for which he criticized other serial killers. Isreal grew too confident. He began to enjoy following the media coverage around his crimes. The time between his crimes grew shorter and shorter. He began taking greater risks and ultimately he broke his own cardinal rule. He struck close to home. In the year before the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig, Keyes was getting sloppy. Isreal admitted to the FBI during one interview that in March 2011 he rode his bike out to Point Worozow Park in West Anchorage. There he intended to shoot a couple who were sitting in their car in a sniper-style attack. He hid in the woods, ready to fire upon the couple when an Anchorage police cruiser pulled up on the scene. Isreal Keyes was ready to kill this officer as well, until a backup unit arrived moments later. Now, the scenario was too precarious, and Isreal relented, recognizing the risk he'd be about to take. Isreal decided to purchase a police scanner. He wasn't ready to get caught. I almost got myself in a lot of trouble on that one, Isreal would tell authorities. The FBI ultimately connected 11 victims to Isreal Keyes, but the possibility remains he had many, many more. Only Isreal Keyes knew the true extent of his crimes.